Hi, I'm good, thanks. Nice to meet you.
Good morning. I know it's morning there, and thank you for agreeing to have this interview with us. And nice to meet you too. I'm gonna first give you a little introduction about KHANA, if you know about it, or if not, I'm gonna give you a little introduction, and then I'm gonna ask a few questions, so that there are people joining as well. They can see, and then we're gonna publish this later as well.
Great, sounds good.
Yeah. So KHANA is the home of think tanks in Iran, and what it does is that it facilitates think tank activity and academic and intellectual dialogues. This new series that we're doing is interviewing with international activists and international academics, hoping to foster the international dialogue between activists here and academics here and those that are outside of Iran. So can you just introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, should I just say my background, a
Yes,
full
please,
introduction?
yes.
My name is Calla Walsh. I'm 21 years old. I'm a freelance journalist, but I'm more known for being an activist and an organizer involved in the anti-imperialist movement in the US. I helped launch the Palestine Action Direct Action campaign in the US after the Al-Aqsa flood as part of this international campaign that was started in the UK. And we successfully shut down the first Elbit office in the US. And I also served time in jail for actions I participated in.
Thank you. What you do is very inspirational to us, and we know that you recently came to Iran. Is that correct?
I did. I was there for a week in mid-July. It was amazing.
How did you find Iran? What was your experience in the festival, in the Stove Festival?
Wow, I'm definitely not going to pay service in words to what an incredible experience it was. It was my first time in Iran. It was my first time in the region, and my first time, in a country that is militarily resisting Zionism and this genocide. And I think what struck me the most is how revolutionary and how optimistic and unified the people are, despite Iran being a very debative and complex and at times contradictory society. The levels of unity amongst all the people against imperialism and in the face of this recent aggression were really breathtaking. And so we saw a lot of the sites of destruction and just the horrific attacks targeting all levels of Iranian society. But we also saw the rebuilding and the mourning of the martyrs, and that people kept telling us everywhere we went that the war had made them stronger than before and that they are ready for it to start again.
Thank you so much for that answer. I'm going to ask you a bit about U.S. activism in the U.S. especially. You're one of the most vocal young anti-imperialist activists in the U.S. What happened that you went into this path?
Yeah, I got involved at a very young age, and all of the positions I've arrived at have really been through practice and putting different tactics and strategies into practice and seeing over time that working within the system, working within the Democratic Party, working within US Congress, and all of these entities and forces that ultimately at the end of the day serve weapons companies is not how we are going to make change. And so over my time as a young person being involved, I arrived more and more at the necessity of direct action, of militancy, of rooting our struggle in the political prisoners in the United States. And a lot of that inspiration, comes from the Palestinian struggle and its militancy and its refusal, to compromise or negotiate with the imperialists committing genocide. And as well as its rootedness in political prisoners as its compass. And I think the Al-Aqsa flood really, put the question of what struggle looks like back on the table as Palestinians escalated their own resistance and the genocide escalated in response. We had to contend with what a response looks like here. And I think we've seen over 2 years that just protesting and just voicing our outrage is insufficient, and that we also need to take material action. And that's something I thought a lot about when I was in Iran at all these sites of destruction and aggression. After seeing these attacks and atrocities for years on my phone, to actually stand physically in the rubble was breathtaking. And I couldn't stop thinking about how the weapons used to cause that destruction are built in the United States and built in our backyards and by our neighbors. Like, I'm calling to you from a part of Massachusetts where the biggest employer here is General Dynamics, which is a huge weapons company. And so the resiliency and the steadfastness of people in Iran, despite being under siege and warfare and losing colleagues and family members and community members, I think should really inspire us here to never give up hope, because we have so much more fighting left to be done.
Yes, hopefully. I wanted to ask, how has it been to organize in the US, especially as a young woman, against powerful structures like Zionism and imperialism, especially them having a lot of way in the US with how things work?
It's definitely an uphill battle. I mean, nearly every institution in this country is complicit in not only Zionism, but the entire world system of U.S.-led imperialism, collaboration with the U.S. military, with police stations, with carceral institutions here. And we can't forget, too, that the U.S. is built upon stolen land and genocide of the indigenous people, just like the process that Israel is carrying out in Palestine right now. I think definitely as a young woman, I am not always taken seriously or respected in political spaces, and my age or gender are used to write my positions off. And I will say that in Iran, I felt so respected and honored by being invited there and my voice being valued and taken seriously. I think, the repression that came down upon me and my co-defendants who I was in jail with is also a testament to the, violence of this power structure. We were facing 37 years in prison. We ended up only doing 40 days in jail. We struck a deal. But for a while, it felt like we'd spend the rest of our lives in prison. And we had no contact orders, so we weren't even allowed to speak with each other. We are still under federal investigation. And every time I fly in and out of the country or just in any airport, I get treated like a terrorist. But I think all of this response and this repression, especially to, that kind of action that we did, which was by no means like a guerrilla or military action, the repression coming down in response to it shows how scared and weak this power structure is, and how strong our movements are becoming. And I think the brazen, unprovoked aggression by the US and the Zionist entity on Iran and the entire axis of resistance is also a similar response. It's a response of a dying and weak empire that can only, lash out to attempts to cling on to power. And my case and my legal issues are resolved, but there's so many people in the US that are still facing horrific repression, including many young people, for the actions that they've taken to protest the genocide and to literally enforce international law against genocide when our government is failing to. And I think that also exposes the hypocrisy of all this U.S. propaganda about Iran being this horrific, repressive regime, when Iran is actually enforcing international law against genocide, and the U.S. is punishing its citizens for doing that.
Yeah, sadly, that is happening. I guess worldwide, also in Europe as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a real potential for shifting mainstream U.S. discourse and, I mean, European discourse or the Western discourse on the issue of Palestine? Do you think that's happened already?
Yeah, I think support for Palestine has become relatively much more mainstreamed than it was, say, in 2021. I think there's been a huge shift of anti-Zionist consciousness. I think anyone with a phone can see this genocide for what it is, and there have been millions of people in the streets in all these major Western cities for years now, and yeah, I think there's been a huge shift, but with the mainstreaming of a pro-Palestine position, there also comes a co-optation and a watering down of what anti-Zionism means. And so we have to be very principled with how we engage in, like more mainstream actors, platforms, celebrity figures that are taking a pro-Palestine stance, because often that might mean they're actually supportive of a two-state solution and rehabilitating the Zionist entity and propping up the Palestinian Authority. And so being very clear that we mean a free Palestine from the river to the sea, that we support the Palestinian armed struggle, but also that we don't see what is playing out, what the US and Israel are enacting as isolated solely in Palestine. This is a war against the entire axis of resistance to dismantle its entire supply chain, and the alternative that it poses to imperialism, and especially Iran being the state power that has contributed to building out the axis of resistance and standing with Hezbollah and Hamas and Ansar Allah, etc. So we need to be very clear that, yeah, this war is a broader war, and that the Zionist entity has its broader goals of building out a greater Israel and for crushing all possible resistance to its settler colonial expansion, and that the U.S. is not just complicit, it is actively facilitating and collaborating in all of these plans.
One question that comes to mind, I mean, these days is that, of course, everyone is now talking about, I mean, not everyone, but a lot of people are now talking about the starvation in Gaza, or like, we've seen the new talks from the Prime Minister of the UK saying that we will recognize Palestine in September. Do you think politicians are now being scared of people's awareness, or do you think this is part of their game? What do you think will happen in the next few months after seeing so much, I guess, backlash against Zionism happening more worldwide?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are trying to do damage control for how awful starving millions of children makes them look. I don't think they're going to stop starving millions of people in Gaza. I think they're going to continue to manipulate their propaganda, and especially these performative aid drops from other countries, and these, these carefully worded statements from Western leaders to, cover their own complicity while also not doing anything materially to push Israel to stop the genocide at all. I think they're going to continue all of that to manipulate this narrative. And really, we need to stop expecting, Western genocidal regimes to be the ones to intervene, and we need to look to the masses of all of these countries, especially, as George Abdallah said in his speech upon his release, the Egyptian masses, to, break the siege and to rise up in solidarity with the people in Gaza. But I think it's really important, despite how horrific the images we are seeing, despite how horrific the starvation is. I mean, I have friends who are in Gaza. I have friends who are aid workers in Gaza who I talk to all the time. And despite, how hopeless the situation is getting, people there have not lost hope, and we can't afford to be defeatist, especially those of us in the West. We have seen these starvation campaigns before, like in Yemen, for years and years and years, and the people of Yemen are still unified and resisting, stronger than ever before. And so I think I have seen a level of defeatism in recent weeks too, that we can't forget the resistance is still, executing powerful operations against the IOF and getting close to abducting more soldiers and inflicting great damages on the enemy. And so remembering that this is asymmetrical warfare against a huge technologically advanced enemy, and that the losses of the side of the colonized and the oppressed are always going to appear greater, but in the end, victory is still ours.
Yes, hopefully. So you talked about that we should be expecting, I guess, the Arab countries or other countries that have not been acting up to act up instead of expecting the Westerns to do this. I wanted to ask that what possibilities do you see for building stronger solidarity between movements in the global South and with the movements that are happening, like, for example, by the youth in the West? How can there be a better connection now?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question, because our liberation is all intertwined, not just in a rhetorical sense, but the material processes of the liberation of exploited people in the West, and the internal colonies in countries in the West are intertwined with the liberation of the global South. And I think we've seen that with how protest has surged since the Al-Aqsa flood, and people are developing new forms of organizing around their own liberation here. I think that in Iran, there is such a powerful sense of internationalism that I guess I knew a little bit about, but also still it took me off guard with how just internationalists like the Iranian people are, but also going everywhere. You see Patrice Lumumba Street, Bobby Sands Street. In the former US Embassy, there is a room dedicated to heroes of anti-imperialism with pictures of Fidel and Che and Malcolm X and Mao and Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar. And so we need to see our struggles in the West as part of this international axis of resistance, and that resistance is something that we can, organize in our own communities, particularly around the national question. I think in the U.S., with all the Palestine protests and with protests against ICE, etc., we realize that no matter what we are protesting, if we're protesting against repression or against oppression, we are going to be brutalized by the police, and we're going to be repressed by the police. And it really comes down to a question of how are we, struggling against this racist occupying force that is the U.S. police, which developed out of, a slave catching force. And so I think developing an analysis of our own conditions through the framework of settler colonialism and imperialism, because the US and the Zionist entity have the same DNA. They were developed through the same processes. And so we have a lot to learn from the Palestinian liberation struggle and how we are going to overthrow oppression in the US. Another example I would point to is the what has been termed the LA Intifada in Los Angeles, and the very mass militant uprisings that happened there in protest to ICE, which is like a modern Gestapo that is hunting and kidnapping people and disappearing them by the thousands in broad daylight. And the internationalism we saw in those protests, people were waving Palestine flags, Mexican flags, flags of all the Central and South American countries. People were waving PFLP banners and Hamas banners and Burkina Faso flags. It was incredible. But I think in the US, we see often these like moments of rupture and mass protest and militancy, but then they kind of fizzle out and they're not channeled into protracted struggle. And so I think we have a lot to learn from the axis of resistance and how protracted struggle and, developing sovereignty over our own resources and our own resistance is.
So my next question is, I guess as part of what we've talked about already, but I want to ask that what gives you hope in the face of such massive systems of violence and oppression worldwide? You did touch on it before, but I wanted a clear answer to this as well.
What gives me hope, I think, is having an analysis of what struggle is, what revolution is, and how empires fall. If I had expected it to happen in a day or a week or a month or a year or even my lifetime, I think I would probably lose hope or feel defeatist. But because I see this as a much broader struggle that spans generations, that spans lifetimes, even if I don't see victory in my lifetime, if I've made a contribution to advance the struggle, that is what matters. And I think in the West, we often lose sight of the long-term protracted struggle, or we want to just claim easy, immediate victories. But empires don't fall in an instant, and this is going to be a long, brutal struggle, especially against the United States, which is a greater, more violent and expansive empire than we've ever seen in the history of this world. I grew up in the US, I've always lived here, but my family is like of Irish ancestry, and I can't help but think about how Irish people were first invaded by colonizers in 1169. They've been fighting guerrilla warfare against colonialism for over 800 years. And have made many victories, but also are still not completely decolonized. And so I think we just have to be very rooted in the belief that we can win, and that it is possible within our lifetimes, especially now more than ever. I think the enemy is more weak than ever. And if people in the most dire conditions have not given up hope, then none of us have a right to give up hope or the luxury of giving up hope, because only the belief that we can win is what is going to carry us to victory.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions of people that are online. If not, I want to ask you to just give anything else that you could tell, because this will be published in the KHANA website and the KHANA chats, and it will be seen by the intellectual and by the academics of Iran. So if you can give me any other things that I haven't asked, I would be thankful. I think there's no questions from anyone. So please, if anything else to wrap up.
Yeah, I guess I feel like I didn't speak enough on just what the experience was in Iran, so I'd love to add on a little bit there. I mean, I felt just so grateful to be welcomed with such kindness into Iran. As someone coming from the US, my government is responsible for so much violence and hardship inflicted on Iran, and we were told over and over again by everyone, everywhere, that, we see the US government as separate from its people, and the US people are our friends. I think for me, coming from the US, I feel like sometimes that's even too generous, because I do see that a lot of people here are complicit in the genocide, and are happy to continue their daily lives as usual while feeding off the super profits of imperialism and the oppression of the global South. And so I think we need to not be complacent. We need to, those of us in the West need to demand more of ourselves and demand more of each other and those of us around us in how we are struggling and escalating our resistance to Zionism and imperialism. I think there's also so much to learn from the steadfastness of Iran. I mean, the people who organized this festival and brought us around to do our reporting and witness the destruction and just learn about Iranian society. These were people working day in, day out, like barely sleeping. And they were people who'd been under direct missile siege themselves, who may have lost family members or colleagues, like the media martyrs, during this attack, and were immediately back to work, working harder than ever before. And I think, you know, in the West, because we are not used to having real material victories or material power, that we are quicker to give up or let one setback lead us to defeatism. And just the unyielding resiliency was really, really inspiring. I also think the targeting of all these civilian sites that we visited. I mean, many of the sites we visited would be an apartment where a nuclear scientist was killed, but also his entire family and also all of his neighbors. And of course, the killing of a nuclear scientist is never justified to begin with, nor were any of the Zionist and U.S. attacks. But in the U.S., like there's a tendency, even with people who stood with Iran against Israel, to only say we stand with the Iranian people, or like to separate the people from the so-called regime or the government. And that's not a real distinction. Like that's not reality. And Netanyahu uses the same exact distinction. He put out propaganda during the attack saying that he stands with the Iranian people, even naming these slogans that have originated from the West, like women, life, freedom. And it's beyond clear that this is a war against the entire Iranian people, and really that what they did to Syria, they want to do to Iran in terms of completely gutting and collapsing the state sovereignty and cutting off all these supply chains to any resistance to Zionism. And so I think it's very important to note that like even so many Iranians that we met with, that we talked with, of course, have like complicated opinions on everything in Iran and have agreements and disagreements with their government, like any people living anywhere under any government do. But what's most important is that they are standing with their government and their people and their sovereignty in the face of these attacks. And so anyone from the West, you know, pushing for regime change right now, pushing to accelerate these divisions rather than push for unity against imperialism, is only doing the work of Zionism. And it's important to call out those voices when they are in pro-Palestine spaces even.
Yes, exactly. We did see a lot of unity after the war, and we're really hopeful that we can see this. And we're really hopeful that American and Western activists and intellectuals can now see, I guess, more of the real Iran and the real Iranian regime and the people as well. Thank you so much for your views and for your expanding on all the questions. We really enjoyed this, and we really appreciate the fact that you came and you spoke to us. We hope that there will be more relationships between the intellectuals and the activists in Iran and in the West. People like you. Thank you so much again. Hopefully we'll talk again later on different topics. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And yeah, I'm happy to come back anytime or connect you with my other colleagues if you need people to speak on specific things.
Thank you so much. We really enjoyed it. Hope you have an amazing day, and hope we keep up the resistance until imperialists are gone and we're done with them.
Marbar America.
Nagara Amrika. Thank you so much.
Have a good day. Thank
too.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.